Hi everyone, this is Dr. Rebecca Troy, and today I'm going to just kind of cover some information about how do you know if your child has dyslexia. Over the years, I fielded this question a lot, and so today I'm just going to cover some of the basics about some of the warning signs and symptoms that you would look for in your child. So first, let's start with just a definition so that everybody's on the same page with what it actually means to have dyslexia. So it's an unexpected difficulty that's characterized when the child has a regular or even above average IQ coupled with surprisingly low reading. So there is usually this discrepancy between the child's intelligence and their performance with reading and language tasks. So it's the brain's inability to hear and respond to language as a typical reader would. And so we'll talk about this in a minute, but the brain literally is using a different portion than a typical reader would. So one of the things that I'm finding right now is that it is harder in the time of COVID for us to be truly identifying and screening as we would normally do for dyslexia. So when you're doing virtual instruction, when you have kids on computers, it is harder for educators to have their eyes on kids and their development the way that they would have typically. And so what do I mean by that? As educators, we're always watching, observing, using formative assessment to try to see what the kid is able to do and not able to do. And virtual instruction has made that really, really challenging. And so, as a parent, you really have to kind of tune in to some of the key warning signs because it is harder for educators to kind of do that assessment and screening in the way that they may have in the past, which sometimes is not always that great. So, one of the first questions that I typically get is what age can you start to see signs of dyslexia? It's actually possible to start noticing traits once your child begins to speak. And so that can be as early as a year and a half to 2 years old, but it is much more common to start seeing those things pop up in the pre-K, so like late 3, 4 years old, and also into kindergarten. So those would be a common time to start noticing some of these things. So common traits that would show up is the child's inability to rhyme. So if I said, for example, to my daughter, okay, Elle, say cat. She should be able to then try to rhyme with cat, bat, mat, sat, rat, pat. But a child with dyslexia doesn't really have the ability to do that because in their brain, they have to segment that there is an onset sound and a rhyme sound. And so one of those things can be changed, the other one remains the same. And so just the idea that the brain could break that word into multiple segments and then manipulate that is really, really challenging for someone with dyslexia. So that would show up as a problem. Children that have dyslexia are often slow to recognize or name their letters. So, might really struggle to learn the alphabet. You will likely see them forget or struggle to learn what we would call easy words or sight words, words like and, that, is, the, things that maybe don't have like a phonetic identifier, if you will, but the child just does not have the ability to kind of hang on to those words, and that starts to come out at that level. Um, so the child can sometimes struggle in the spoken language itself, either that their speaking is delayed or they may have trouble retrieving words later on. So, I'm trying to think of a word and I can't really get there, having trouble describing this thing. So the retrieval of language and or vocabulary can sometimes be very difficult. Attaching letters to the sound that they represent. They may struggle to know the letters in their own name. When reading and early decoding starts in kindergarten, they would start to show difficulties in that as well as any reading activities. Listening to books would be just fine, but anything that they would be doing independently would be visibly a struggle. So when the child moves from the pre-K kindergarten into more of the kindergarten first grade, some of the things start to change. So for example, the child may struggle to understand that words come apart. So for example, if I said, okay, how many sounds do we hear in baseball? You would be able to break it apart into syllables, base, and ball. And so that concept is usually tricky. Inability to connect sounds and symbols, so the B makes a B. Errors that show that they're really struggling to connect the sound and symbol. Inability to read common one-syllable words. Difficult to sound out those sight words. They complain already about how hard reading is. It looks physically hard, like it's painful, and or that you may have a history of parents or siblings with reading issues. So dyslexia is highly heritable. It can be between 50 and 80% sometimes that if someone in your family has it, that you could also inherit the traits. So then moving forward, if you look at a child that's in second grade or above, they have areas, multiple areas with issues. So one would be problems in speaking. So even without a text in front of them, they may struggle to pronounce long, unfamiliar, or complicated words. They may not sound very fluent when they're speaking, like they would pause or hesitate a lot. They would struggle retrieving vocabulary. So they might describe something as stuff or things, not really be able to find the exact word or be confused on which word to use. It does typically take them time to summon an oral response, and they may also have difficulty remembering dates, names, and telephone numbers. So that same age child is also going to have problems in reading. So you start to see that there is a separation between this child and their peers. So they're making very, very slow, if any, progress in acquiring reading skills, whereas their peers are very easily doing those things. They don't seem to have a strategy to read new or unfamiliar words. Again, we're struggling with just those little teeny words like that, and, in, the. The child may omit entire parts of a word when they're reading, and then come some of the social pieces. So they're terribly fearful or embarrassed, or they start to avoid reading out loud. You might hear the child sound choppy, or like it's physically, again, painful for the child to be reading. They have trouble reading anything but memorized words. So again, because dyslexia and intelligence are not mutually exclusive, you can have a really, really bright child that has memorized a ton of words that masks that there is a problem until much later on, because they've memorized so much. And then you already start to see the lower self-esteem. So when you think about young adults and adults, it is possible that you just kind of miss some of those things early on, especially because of COVID. So in young adults and adults, they would have all of the difficulties that we mentioned, but in addition, there would be embarrassment caused by oral reading or avoidance, like, oh, I'd like to get up and go to the bathroom, or I'd like to go get a drink of water at the time that it's my turn. I find reading to be exhausting. I avoid it. I dislike it. I might even use words like hate. When I read something, it's going to be slow for most of my materials. I spend an unusually long amount of time doing schoolwork or work-related work, and I have almost no desire to read for pleasure unless it is something that's on an audio tape. When you look at the spelling of a person with dyslexia in young adulthood or adulthood, often it is described as disastrous or horrific, terrible, because there are many, many of those sounds, syllables, letters that are entirely missing or added that just don't belong. So sometimes I get asked, like, well, why would I want to get a diagnosis? Like, what does the diagnosis get me? Um, and really, the short answer is that the diagnosis is going to offer you some clarity. So there can be a period, especially for a child that never got diagnosed, where you start to wonder, like, gosh, what is wrong with me? I just can't seem to get it. All of my peers are getting it. There must be something unique or terrible about me. And so sometimes just the clarity of, okay, you have this thing, here's what it is, that clarity can sometimes help to develop an effective plan to support and treat the difficulty. It has the potential to unburden the parent, the child, the teacher from an often confusing or frustrating situation. And you have some critical information that's required to go forward with the determination. So once I know that I have this diagnosis, now maybe I can think about what I might want to do with that information, or figure out what kind of treatments or programs that I might want to pursue. Now, in some states, in some schools, having a diagnosis means that you get access to some treatment or programs, or you might get access to accommodations or modifications or the rights to those things. But it's important to know that uh, diagnosis does not equal treatment. So I guess in general, what a diagnosis gets you is the certainty that this is in fact what the problem has been all along. And now you can have a little bit more information about ways to move forward. So there are a couple of different ways that you can get a diagnosis. You can approach your school, and the school psychologist would be the person to administer the assessment battery. Um, Usually, when that assessment battery is done, they get finished and they say, this is someone that has the traits of someone with dyslexia. Um, Sometimes the school will go ahead and diagnose the child with dyslexia, but often there is a hesitancy to label that child. And if they do, it often requires a very, very low threshold. So maybe the 10th percentile or lower. So the child could very well have dyslexia and have some high compensatory skills, very high IQ, and perform in maybe the 30th or 40th percentile, still really struggle and have a brain that doesn't process language in the way that a typical reader would, but not get diagnosed within the system because the score, if you will, isn't low enough. The other way to get a diagnosis is to go see a neuropsychologist and get an evaluation. Typically, when that happens, they would look at the total scope and do a whole panel. So they would look at other co-occurring disabilities, whether the child had auditory processing speed issues, vision issues. So there's often ADHD screening at the same time when you do a neuropsych evaluation. So if you're looking to try to get an evaluation, you'd want to try to establish that your child has got a reading problem that is different compared to their age and or education level, so that discrepancy. And then you're gathering evidence that would support its unexpectedness. So this is maybe coming from, if my child has got a high IQ, it would be expected that they should be performing in a high way, so to speak, when they're reading. But we've got this unexpected performance. And so that's where it gets difficult, because the student could be performing in an average range. And the school or others may look at your child and say, oh, there's not a problem here because your child is average. But the problem is that that's not expected based on how the child's intelligence would match, so to speak. So if the child is highly intelligent, their reading skills should also be quite high. So it would be an unexpectedness in the low way that you'd want to look for. This child would demonstrate evidence of phonologic weakness, along with other higher level language functions that would be relatively unaffected. So Here are some of the things that you might notice at the same time that your child gets a diagnosis. It's not uncommon for them to say, okay, auditory processing is also an issue. Your child has processing speed issues. Your child has rapid naming issues, working memory issues, letter word identification, pseudo word decoding, reading fluency. So those would all be common things that somebody could say, yep, your child is struggling with that. What's tricky is that not everybody knows that those things, when combined together, equal dyslexia. So watch for that. A child with dyslexia is usually better at comprehension, long-term retrieval. They're fluid with their intelligence. They usually have good visual spatial processing. They have average or superior intelligence. And then again, like I was saying, the disparity between intelligence and reading. So the discrepancy between their academic potential and their actual success is what you should look at in order to diagnose someone with dyslexia. So again, you're not looking to say, wow, this child's an average reader, therefore they don't have dyslexia. That's not true, nor is that how it should be diagnosed. So I often get this question, do I have to have a diagnosis in order to get treatment? No, you do not. So diagnosis can also be very, very costly. It would not be uncommon for you to spend $3,000 to $5,000 plus to get a diagnosis, but that doesn't mean you also get a treatment. That just means that they tell you on the piece of paper, here's what's happening with your child. So if you suspect that your child has an issue, it is perfectly okay to start trying research-based methods to see if it can resolve the problem. So a diagnosis is going to confirm your suspicions, but it is often a very expensive, laborious process that leaves you without treatment options. So, in some cases, it might be beneficial to screen. It's more cost effective, it gives you a clear picture. Many schools and states will offer screening services for free. Sally Shaywitz has come up with the Shaywitz Dyslexia Screen. And so, if you know already that you, like, oh gosh, yes, I think that we are experiencing all these things, definitely email me if you're interested in learning more information about how to screen your child for dyslexia. So, just kind of based on some of the feedback that I've been getting, we're going to be offering a screening materials mini course. And so, if you think that you might be interested in that, definitely reach out so that I can help support you in screening your child to see if they do, in fact, have dyslexia. Um, you can also treat whether you have a diagnosis or not. So if you are interested in treatment, I invite you to book a call with us right away. Those calls are free, but what we do is we try to help you to get to the bottom of what hasn't been working with your child's reading and get you on the path to making a transformation immediately. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. I wanted to kind of be brief, but those are some of the main things that you'd want to look for to see whether or not your child has the traits of dyslexia. Again, please don't hesitate to reach out if you have questions. Thanks, everybody.